Discourse, a magical realm within rhetorical study that can be defined as, well, a lot of things. But it definitely isn't this. Discourse was originally defined by some dude named Zelig Harris in 1952 as a sequence of statements whose length is greater than the sentences. This is a very simple definition referring to extended speech that has developed meaning between sentences. And why would anyone want to change that? Turns out Michel Foucault would, because apparently you can't just call a combination of statements discourse. To Foucault, discourse is more a practice than it is statements about the world. Foucault's 1969 work, The Archaeology of Knowledge, does not necessarily provide its own specific definition of discourse, but rather works to define what it is not, as well as how discourses are formed and function. He explains that the source of discourse is not authors, speakers, or nature. Discourse isn't just a way of identifying things in the world in order to understand reality. Instead, discourse is formed as an action that produces knowledge over time. It is not comprised of individual objects of knowledge or sources, but the relationships that those objects and sources have with each other. These sources could exist in the form of institutions like school or families. Discourse, the relationship between objects of knowledge and their sources, results in knowledge. In fact, Foucault states that there is no knowledge without a particular discursive practice, and any discursive practice may be defined by the knowledge that it forms, and that it is in discourse that power and knowledge are joined together. He begins Chapter 3 of Part 2 of his Archaeology of Knowledge by utilizing the field of psychiatry as an example of a discourse forming knowledge. Psychiatry is seen as a field that is able to perform discourse because it combines objects of knowledge and their sources and creates information by looking at the relationships between them. The sources of mental illnesses include families, social groups, the workplace, and art. Foucault acknowledges that these sources are very distant and distinct from each other, but psychiatric discourse is able to hone in on these sources and determine what mental illnesses a person has. That relationship between psychiatric knowledge and the source of a person's illness can lead to a psychiatrist being able to form a diagnosis. And continuing to define psychiatric discourse, Foucault looks at the sources of its set parameters, defining them as the institution of medicine, which objectified mental illnesses, laws, which determined when and how a person is legally mentally ill, and art and literature, which have transformed the field of psychiatry into a language that needs to be interpreted. Foucault finally finishes proving the existence of psychiatric discourse by explaining how it categorizes mental illnesses and relates them to each other in order to create more knowledge. By combining the relationships between the source of mental illnesses, the source of the set limits of mental illnesses, and the categorization of mental illnesses themselves, Foucault indicates that psychiatry is a discursive practice because it relies on the relationships of multiple factors of knowledge and sources to gain information. He went on to write Order of Discourse in 1981, where he laid out the powers of discourse. It describes the relationship between language and knowledge and the purpose of discursive communities. Discourse is also an epistemological practice because it shows how certain things come to be known as true. Lastly, discourse can be used to exert power. I know that was a lot about Foucault, but he's the big guy for discourse. He's kind of who everyone points to when you talk about it, and he kind of founded discourse in general because the term wasn't really used in the way that he defined it. It was now something that could be applied to different communities that aim to create knowledge. And then, that was about it for defining discourse for a while. It was used to analyze how cultures are legitimized through discourse in 1971, how people stayed focused in conversations in 1981, how the narratives of stories were structured in 1983, and how discourse applied to both sociology and research methods in 1984. The 90s shifted the focus of Foucault's definition of discourse to how cognitive abilities such as attention, memory, and problem-solving could be reframed into forms of discourses. The definition didn't really change, but it was used in so many different ways that the conversation around discourse seemed to be constantly evolving. A consistent eureka-mum of, wait, I feel like I could use discourse theory to talk about this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and yada yada yada. But Foucault's definition of discourse wasn't the only one at work during the 90s. Oh, you really thought you could understand discourse that easily, huh? Think again, because we're going to completely redefine it. Thank you, James Paul G. Yes, that is his name, and yes, those are his real teeth, and no, he is not a Dr. Seuss character. Our man James decided that Foucault's definition of discourse was just not enough. But I guess he didn't want to say that explicitly, so he capitalized the first letter of discourse and made it mean something completely different. Capital D discourse. G defined it in 1989 as ways of being in the world and forms of life that integrate words, acts, values, beliefs, attitudes, and social identities. In simple terms, discourses are frameworks for how you should be based on your situation in society. And you can't teach this, you have to let someone practice a discourse with you for them to catch on. We begin life with our primary discourse, which tells you from the very beginning how to understand the world and your place in it. Then we go on to participate in secondary discourses that are a part of external institutions like school or other communities that you attribute yourself to. Within secondary discourses, you have dominant and non-dominant discourses. Dominant discourses are secondary discourses that are participated in for the purpose of gaining money or a better reputation. Non-dominant ones only increase your reputation within a specific limited social setting. For instance, becoming known as a silly guy boosts your reputation among the people you hang out with and functions as a non-dominant discourse. That doesn't mean it isn't important, though, I hope. G mentions that discourses have the ability to conflict with each other as well as transfer some of their aspects to other discourses. In fact, you can fail to master a discourse and inadvertently master a different one. For instance, you could fail to learn a new language but come to know your primary language even better in the process. While G's definition of capital D discourse is useful terminology, it isn't a completely applicable framework to work off of. You cannot truly participate in a discourse unless you master it, and G admits that this mastery of a discourse will rarely or never happen. I guess it's just kind of this end goal that we're all supposed to try to achieve. Miguel A. Cabrera, a linguist who I could not find a picture for, so this is the Miguel Cabrera you get, somewhat agreed with G's definition of discourse. He stated in 2004 that discourse is a coherent body of categories, concepts, and principles by means of which individuals apprehend and conceptualize reality. In this case, however, there is more focus on people being subjects to discourse. They use discourse to determine how they should behave, as well as why they do what they do in society. Discourse is a sort of legitimation for social constraints in this manner. Discourse is currently used as a practice of communicating and sharing information. It is also looked at in terms of how discourse functions in the study of how language works in a broad social context. I think that discourse could continue to be used in the way that Foucault says it does, but look at G's theories of discourse less as just a definition of discourse, but rather as a way of identifying the relationships between discourses and ideologies of a society. Both of these limit and legitimize human behavior, so I think capital D discourses could be viewed in the same lens as repressive ideologies. We could then evaluate which discourses serve solely to legitimize, which work to redefine how humans should behave, and which ones simply try to develop new knowledge. The evolution of discourse shows that rhetorical frameworks can change rapidly and in relation to the social implications of the time. Discourse is useful in rhetoric because rhetoric both participates in and attempts to form capital D discourses. Invitational rhetoric is very closely tied to Foucault's definition of discourse, as it involves a group of people that share ideas and generate knowledge. That knowledge isn't just accepted by one author or speaker, as it tends to be the case in traditional rhetoric. Foucault's definition also plays into the rhetorical study of how we attribute the essence of truth to certain statements about the world, functioning epistemologically. When confronting these problems of what is true, we can track how that truthfulness was attributed to an object of knowledge by looking at the discourses that generated it. I just realized that you watching this means that you're participating in both a discourse and the action of discourse. So I guess you already knew what it was and how to do it. That would have been nice to know before I said all that stuff.